the next panel. And we will discuss the area of science and innovation. So it has been mentioned by His Excellency Ambassador Fasel that this is another area where we can look forward to potential future cooperation. And it's an area where we see the two countries as being forerunners. And we have a very interesting panel today to discuss those matters. We will start with Lutz Peter Berg from the Swiss Embassy. He is Head of Science and Innovation for the UK, Ireland, and the Nordic countries. And his work includes bilateral projects and programs with various science stakeholders, as well as policy work around international relationships in science, skills, innovation, and science diplomacy. He runs on behalf of the Swiss Innovation Agency, an accelerator for Swiss startups exploring the UK. And he has a background in biomedical research and R&D. He holds a PhD in molecular genetics from the University of London and attended the University of Göttingen in Germany and the University of California, Santa Cruz in the US. Our next speaker is Dr. Ann-Kathrin Hahn. She's a partner with iPrime Legal, a boutique firm in Zurich, which focuses on technology, law, and compliance. She mainly assists clients from the technology and life science sectors in avoiding and resolving commercial disputes. She also acts as president of a conciliation commission in charge of gender equality issues within the ETH domain and teaches an arbitration clinic at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Prior to joining iPrime Legal, she was a partner at Baker McKenzie. And our last speaker is Peter Arrowsmith. Peter is partner at GJE, specialized in intellectual property. He's particularly interested in computer implemented inventions, and some of his clients in this area have been involved in artificial intelligence, digital rights management, cloud computing, and social networks. He has worked with a diverse range of global clients, but he particularly enjoys working with high growth technology companies in the UK and advising on IP strategies that can add value. So very welcome to today's event. I'm very much looking forward to this panel, and I give the floor to Lutz Peter Berg.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. When we look at, excuse me, when we look at innovation, the situation is slightly different to financial services. So in contrast to the financial services situation, there are no dedicated bilateral negotiations planned between Switzerland and the UK, at least yet, that would specifically address all the aspects of innovation. So really we're facing a much more complex situation. So what I will do is address from an embassy perspective the potential gaps that are arising or could arise in this area, where we stand in terms of bridging them, and also what are the opportunities to then look further beyond the gaps into intensifying bilateral collaboration. And I'm going to make 4 points. The first one, actually most collaboration in science and innovation between our two countries will continue to be good, because most collaboration, of course, happens outside specific programs, outside dedicated funding. So my lab at the university would collaborate between the UK and Switzerland via conferences, coordinating experiments and co-publishing. In my startup company, we did business development between the two countries, pretty much, or we tried to anyways, pretty much straightforward. After Brexit, this type of work will carry on in significantly, I think, the same way. There might be some restrictions, obviously, freedom of movement has changed, but really overall, I would say this kind of collaboration will not be majorly affected by Brexit or by the Swiss-EU situation, with a few exceptions. And it's worth stating that, it's a little bit stating the obvious, but usually from a government perspective, we tend to look at the big programs, Horizon and so on, but it's actually worth to keep this in mind. My second point then is looking to the European program, which the ambassador already introduced a little bit. The future of UK-Swiss collaboration within this kind of specifically funded program, so stuff that goes over and above what people do with their national grants anyways, the future also actually looks reasonably good. So what I'm talking about specifically really is the Horizon program, the research framework program of the European Union. And as far as Switzerland is concerned in Europe, this is the only game in town, pretty much. You know, this is the main grant scheme for everybody. So Switzerland has no other funded programs with European countries, for example. And just to give you a bit of perspective on size of importance of this. So the Swiss budget that goes into the Horizon program is half as much again as our national science and innovation budget. So if you look at the overall budget the Swiss government spends on science and innovation grants, 1/3 of that goes to Brussels. So this is how important it is. For any Swiss taxpayers amongst you, what happens next is Swiss scientists and companies go back in and are very successful in getting it all back. But just to give you a sense of perspective. So the UK and Switzerland both are very successful in this program, and in fact collaborate extensively. So from a Swiss perspective, for us, the UK is the second most important collaborative partner within Horizon Europe. And we'd like that to carry on after Germany, which is an obvious first place. So I say the prospects are reasonably good, even though, as we heard, we do face potential gaps due to stalled Swiss-EU association negotiations, let's say. Now you're thinking, well, if we might not be able to associate this program, how can you possibly call that reasonably good? Well, the answer is the actual gap that might open up, even if we can't associate, is not our inability to join the program and collaborate within it. It's actually only slightly restricted collaboration. We could still work with partners within the program, just bringing our own Swiss government money and with some restrictions. Some consortia, for example, of key partners might not want Swiss partners there because we don't count for the official geography distribution. But in principle, it wouldn't be impossible to still be involved in some of the work that goes on using our own Swiss money. So on balance, I say, even if we couldn't associate, the gap that would open up can be overcome. And the prospects overall, I would say, are reasonably good. One thing I want to highlight, though, for bilateral collaboration, it could be reasonably good. But for Switzerland alone, if we were not to associate, it would be near disaster, because there's one very important area where money just goes to single scientists. This is the Champions League of European scientists, where the best people get money. If we were not in that, it wouldn't affect necessarily collaboration, but it would be an absolute disaster because we would lose all the prestige and the benchmarking that we really need. So the third point, the potential gaps, and some of which I've just mentioned, they are being addressed, just many of them not bilaterally in talks between the UK and Switzerland. So, of course, the Horizon, the European platform, that's a multilateral matter, or a matter between Switzerland and the EU. And as we have heard, at the moment, the talks have stalled a little bit, and the EU phrases it a little bit as if the institutional agreement really is the entry ticket to the association negotiations about Horizon. Legally, our position is those two are not connected, and it isn't actually an entry ticket, but politically, at the moment, it clearly is. But I think we are hopeful that, despite the uncertainties now, this might be overcome, and hopefully we will be associated and this will be sorted out. In addition to this main topic, of course, there are some minor gaps outside Horizon. And clearly, talent mobility is one of them, because we've lost freedom of movement. That's been replaced by our national visa systems. So this problem is being partially addressed, at least in a bilateral way. So we have bilateral work streams between the governments on the recognition of qualifications for people who move. That's one aspect. And for example, for student mobility. So both of those are slightly peripheral, if you like, but at least there are some official work streams where this is being tabled. Other things really need unilateral attention. The UK visa system, for example, which has been overhauled, it's quite clever and aimed at attracting actually and keeping international talent. So they have a global talent visa, which brings in global entrepreneurs, top scientists, and it allows students to stay in the country for a number of years after finishing their studies to get a job. So to get into the international talent pool and keep it in the UK is doing very well. Probably we have unilaterally to look at our own system, how we approach that. There's another interesting area, which is even if we are all associated to Horizon, there may be some niche areas that have to do with, if you like, the national security of the European Union, where our countries might be excluded. And at the moment, some aspects of space, so satellite and communications, are penciled in, as well as some quantum technologies, where the UK, as well as Switzerland, and actually Israel, we might find ourselves excluded from Horizon, even though we are associated. At the moment, there's lobbying going on to make sure this doesn't happen. But if it should happen, clearly, that's an area where the countries would have bilateral or even trilateral, hopefully structured program to make up for this shortfall, and would have real opportunities because we are countries that are actually very strong in these areas. And my fourth point then is there are opportunities to intensify the bilateral relationship outside Horizon. But as I've hinted at, it's a little bit of a puzzle, because will there be an institutionalized collaboration between the two countries outside Horizon? Probably not. I don't see any ambition at the moment at government level to do this. There are also practical considerations because if this amount of money goes into Horizon, there's not so much money left to do individual things with other countries. But as I said, exclusion from some parts of Horizon may very well kickstart something in that area. And then there are also other individual initiatives, let's say, which are or should be pursued. So a smart way of doing collaboration is to encourage stakeholders rather than governments setting a top-down approach. And this is happening between our national funding councils, UKRI on the British side and the Swiss National Science Foundation. We already have a mini scheme where we can, if you like, use earmarked money, where money can follow researcher to go across borders and to collaborate with people between Switzerland and the UK. At the moment, this only happens in some areas of social science and arts and humanities. We would like to extend that to make it easier to use the money that's already there in a bilateral way. That's something that's going to be pursued between the stakeholders. Another way for businesses is there are Eurostar calls where each government has a reserved amount of money. If we can collaborate and coordinate those between the UK and Switzerland, we can really guide communities of startups and SMEs working together. Of course, the embassies are doing things on a small scale. I run an inner Swiss camp where we help Swiss startups, for example, to bring their innovation into the UK. Our Swiss Business Hub belongs to SGE. They do trade missions focused on innovation very much. And of course, the British Embassy does the same. So there is stuff happening around the periphery. And then regulation is a big topic. And I think probably the other panelists will have something to say on that. There are immense opportunities in, well, we heard financial, digital, but also pharma, medtech. Clearly, I would say these are great opportunities for individual countries once you're outside the EU. And the UK, my perception is really raring to go on some of those. But the question remains, is it something where Switzerland and the UK will actually align and have common interests? Financial, it sounds like there might well be. But if you look at some other things that are a bit more concrete, if you look at genetically modified agri-foods or sort of stem cells, human cloning for research in the past. The UK has a huge appetite to move on with these areas, and now out of the EU, and some of them they can. Switzerland, not so much. In theory, we probably could, but actually public opinion doesn't really go in that direction. So from our perspective, I think there may be some spanners in the work to make that the basis of bilateral collaboration, but absolutely for each country, or certainly for the UK alone, these are fantastic opportunities. And I'll be very interested to hear what the panelists think about whether that could be a platform of bilateral collaboration. So these 4 points from the embassy perspective really illustrate, I guess, how we try and identify different pieces of the puzzle to overall strengthen our collaboration, and where we can, in a small scale, try and help to put them into the big picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to Anne-Kathrin Hahn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for this interesting overview, which I think really provides a lot of food for thought, as does the comparison with financial services, I find, because of course, I don't know if you can see my screen now. Innovation, at least traditionally, is unlike financial services, an area where market access is not regulated and where international cooperation is the norm. And picking on what Mr. Berg said in the beginning, I think we really can look at innovation, the creation of innovation and the commercialization as something which is very much dependent on an ecosystem that is international by nature and intent. And of course, talent is key for that, mobility of people, room for cooperation across borders. And we know that this could potentially be affected by the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. But there, I think the arrangements which have already been put in place as part of the Mind the Gap strategy are quite effective. So existing rights are being safeguarded. Although the United Kingdom is now a third country from the Swiss perspective, there is additional quantities of work permits that can be made available, at least on a temporary basis. Also, the possibility for short-term visa-free stays and travel has been foreseen in the existing agreements. And then we also need to keep in mind that to a large extent, when we talk about research, doctoral students and postdoctoral students, they get student permits or residence permits without requiring an official work permit that would count against the available numbers. So that doesn't seem to be a huge problem. Other things I think can also be resolved. The United Kingdom, of course, is no longer part of the Erasmus scheme and will be setting up its own scheme for the mobility of students. The Turing scheme, which, as I understand, will only provide financial support to UK students going elsewhere and not to incoming students. But I would assume this is something which can be perhaps addressed at the bilateral level through the waiver of university fees, which of course are higher in the United Kingdom than in Switzerland. As I see it, there is room in the Swiss legislation to also do that unilaterally if that is considered a problem. And then I think we come to the broader issues of what does it take to be an innovative country. I think one aspect is, especially from the perspective of a small country, a need for focus and a need also to be able to rely on players doing the same thing, and that also includes big players. So from the Swiss perspective, I think the focus would be on the pharma and biotech industry. on the one hand, and then on specific aspects of ICT, especially research around artificial intelligence and things like that, where there are also anchor companies such as, for example, for many years, the IBM research lab near Zurich, or the presence of Google in Zurich, I think makes Zurich an attractive place for people working in that field and allows for exchange with the universities and with the many smaller companies. And of course, we also know that these companies are in Switzerland for a reason or for several reasons, and they are not necessarily bound to stay there forever. So that's opening the big discussion about what makes Switzerland an attractive place and how much will it, for how long will it stay an attractive place for international companies. Then I think funding is an issue, of course, funding in research, but also funding for startup companies, especially at the later stage. If you think of biotech companies, the amounts that are required to finance clinical trials are enormous. And one comment that has been made a lot for the Swiss side from many actors is, yes, there is funding during the early stage. At a later stage, it gets more complicated in particular if the situation is compared with the US, of course, because that's a little bit seen as the benchmark. Silicon Valley is where valuations of young companies are much more optimistic than in Europe. And I think the United Kingdom perhaps stands a little bit in the middle as also a country that culturally is closer to the United States and a country that is home to venture capital and to private equity. And it's not just the money, I think it's also the expertise, for example, in valuing business models, especially digital business models, which is quite novel and more difficult than assessing the value of an industrial operation, for example. If you think of things like software as a service models, you have to think about the incomes that they might generate over years, and the approach is a little bit different. I think that's an area where that informal cooperation between the two countries can be interesting because there is know-how on both sides. And then I think another point that is important and that is complex in some areas at least is legal certainty and regulatory alignment. So legal certainty has a lot of aspects. I would say one point, and Peter will be able to comment on that, is property rights, IP rights. That is largely handled outside of the European framework. It gets more complicated again if you think about digital business models, because we then have to touch on questions of what is data and what are the use rights or perhaps the property rights in data. And then, of course, that's also the area where the regulatory alignment or the differences are really relevant, because we see a risk of enhanced or fragmentation, I would say. Of course, the United Kingdom now has the possibility to shape its own rules also in the digital space. GDPR is no longer applying, but, and this is very clear from the Swiss perspective, being considered equivalent with the GDPR regime is very important. It's important especially for small countries, but not only. If you consider to what extent GDPR has been exported and has been accepted as a standard in the world, wanting to set a separate standard becomes quite tricky. And I think it's not just about personal data, which is what GDPR regulates, but we're also looking at the broader regulation of digital business models, of artificial intelligence, the digital market, all of which are areas on which the European Union is proposing now to move quite fast and to introduce regulation. We have heard some proposals for regulation in that space from the United Kingdom, but I think they are still fairly vague. It's at an open, it's at an early stage, and it will be interesting to see in what direction this is evolving. Whether the two countries can avoid to align with the European Union on these issues, I would question. Perhaps it is more interesting, and I think that again then goes to the stakeholder involvement. It may be more interesting to try to cooperate in order to influence regulation and legislation and to participate in that. And I definitely see room for that. Also because in my perception, the United Kingdom in many areas of digital transformation is perhaps more advanced as far as acceptance by the general public is concerned. If you think of the discussions we have seen in Europe and in Switzerland around things like the COVID app and digital solutions intended to resolve urgent problems, I have the impression that there is broader acceptance for such solutions in the United Kingdom, also because in that area the UK situation is much less fragmented than in Switzerland. If you think about the health area, public health, in the United Kingdom, you have the National Health Service. In Switzerland, we have many payers, many insurance companies, and 26 cantons which participate, as we now see in connection with how the vaccination program is handled, which have a say. And so it's no surprise that the United Kingdom is more advanced in this. And perhaps there are learnings from that, also from the way that from the legal side and policy side, digital transformation is analyzed not only by the scientists, but by other academics working around those topics. And going to the point of the academic institutions, I think there indeed is room for cooperation and liaising. The GDPR really creates issues for the exchange of data across borders. And that is an issue on which a network of European academies aligned and said, we need a resolution here because we need to be able to exchange at least anonymized data or pseudonymized data, not only within Europe, but also with the United States for research purposes. And while private sector companies find it still challenging but manageable to accommodate to the requirements of the GDPR, for public universities and public research institutions, this is often quite hard because they are asked to accept, for example, remedies or contractual protections which conflict with their own statutory framework. And that is an impediment to research and to collaboration, which I think could be becoming even more relevant in the future, because so much of the science that is happening is reliant on data sets and the ability to exchange data. Another side issue, it's a little bit beyond that topic, but an example of how many exchanges have become more complicated than they were used to relates to the enforceability of judgments. Switzerland is a party to the Lugano Convention. The United Kingdom wanted to do the same thing in order to replicate the existing European regime. And so far, the European answer to that has been, well, you can't join because you're a third country. You're outside of the European Economic Area and you're also outside EFTA. And that, I think, is regrettable because many people stand to lose from that. It's a working system. It creates legal certainty. And to say to a country which, yes, has chosen to move away from the European Union, but is still very much a part of Europe, creates complication for a lot of players, and I'm not sure whether that is desired. So basically, and I will conclude with that, my main point and suggestion would be to facilitate the many ways of informal exchanges and cooperation between the two countries at the level of academia, but also through private companies. And I think the arrangements which have been put in place and are being put in place as part of the Mind the Gap strategy facilitate this to a large extent. But as has been said, they can only do so much. That ecosystem, which is so important for innovation, also needs to continue. And one aspect perhaps is that we're all looking forward to the time when informal exchanges, physical exchanges and meetings without testing requirements or facilitated testing requirements will become possible again between our two countries that are geographically so close to each other and that have also so much in common and a lot of common interests in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Catherine, and I hand over directly to Peter Arrowsmith.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, I thought there were some really nice slides there from Anne-Catherine, just summarizing what it takes to create and commercialize innovation. Perhaps the only thing missing from my perspective is how to protect innovation as well. I guess maybe I'm biased in that sense by being a patent attorney. So I work as a patent attorney here in the UK and across Europe, helping clients in UK and in Switzerland as well. I've got some significant clients in Switzerland to protect their inventions. So I guess I see to some extent the effect of innovation in both of those countries on the ground. But I agree with what Lutz Berg said earlier on, which is that innovation is kind of a broader issue. It's not just about the UK and Switzerland. It's a very international issue, and innovation, as I see it, has no regard for borders really. It occurs, between the clients I work with in the UK and Switzerland. It's amazing actually to see where some of the inventors come from. They're from all over the world, and they're collaborating as teams with countries everywhere. So whatever happens in innovation needs to accept that. So it needs to accept the fact that innovation is international and to encourage it. And I certainly hope that the UK will continue to do that as its negotiations progress, both with Switzerland and elsewhere. One thing which I think is critical both to the UK and Switzerland is the European Patent Convention. So fortunately for me, at least, otherwise I'd be moving to Ireland, I suspect, the European Patent Convention is independent of the European Union. So the UK and Switzerland both participate in the European Patent Convention as non-EU participants. And I think that really is critical to both countries, that they are continuing to be members of that system, and that we see the benefits from it, I think, for applicants, patent applicants located in the UK and Switzerland. One interesting development lately has been the UK's interest in the CPTPP. I always forget what all of the initials stand for, apart from the last three, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the UK is exploring that, which is interesting. But the concern, I guess, for us as patent attorneys is that aspects of that trade agreement are incompatible with the European Patent Convention. So there is a requirement under the CPTPP to have a grace period. So under patent law, as it stands in Europe, if you disclose your invention and then you subsequently file a patent application, that can be very damaging because you're describing the invention, and then later when you file the patent application, you say, is that invention new? The answer, well, no, it's not new because you've already disclosed it. It already exists within the public realm. In other places, such as the United States, inventors have a grace period against their own disclosures, so they can disclose the invention at a conference or something like that, and subsequently file a patent application, which remains valid. So it will be interesting to see how the UK develops its interest in the CPTPP and whether they're able to achieve any kind of carve out on IP that will allow the UK to continue its membership of the European Patent Convention. But actually, it is kind of an interesting example of the way in which the countries like the UK can explore other ways of doing things outside of the European Union, because the grace period is something which is potentially quite beneficial to innovation. They have one in the United States, and I think we could probably all agree that the US has one of the most innovative societies and cultures and frameworks that we know of in the world. And maybe the grace period is to do with that in some ways. So I think the grace period is a great example of something that could be beneficial for industry, but which would be hard to achieve within the European Union. So I kind of hope that the UK, as they explore that, they are able to find a way to operate within the European Patent Convention and to explore ideas like having a grace period as well. So, I think that it's important from an IP perspective that we have international cooperation. The other development in Europe lately has been the unitary patent, which is this initiative to have a single patent which would be effective across the whole of Europe. And it's a good example of how the power of these projects can be diminished by the lack of full participation. So already in the unitary patent, it was only an EU initiative, so Switzerland was never part of it. The UK was part of it when it was in the European Union, but is no longer. Spain is not part of it because they were not happy with some of the language provisions. So what we're left with is a very watered down agreement, which diminishes the value of the entire enterprise. So I hope that we can continue to see greater international cooperation after Brexit. I think the UK and Switzerland share something in being non-EU participants in the European Patent Convention, and I hope that that can continue for a long time. So that's really all I had to say, Eva. Hopefully it adds something to the debate and discussion, which I think has been very interesting today.
No, thank you. Indeed, that was very interesting. And I think you all brought some very interesting points and questions to the discussion. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. I haven't seen any so far, but I would like to give you the opportunity to post them in the chat if you have any. I don't really have any questions. I just wanted to add that I think in the meantime, I'm curious to see what the future holds in this area. But in the meantime, I think we should all try to follow up the idea of the bottom-up approach. And also, Anne-Catherine mentioned it, cooperation between universities and research institutions. We try to do that between my University of Lausanne and the British Institute, and establish cooperations also in the area of digitalization. We have a program that we run for our students in Lausanne on digitalization every year. And we have a cooperation with the EPFL, which is hosting all the data scientists and AI experts that cooperate with us, us lawyers, basically. And there's also the Turing Institute in London, which does a similar work compared to the EPFL. So I think there are various institutions which could come together for closer cooperation, starting from universities and research institutes. And hopefully we see new programs as well that bring the SNF and the UK RI closer together. So I'm quite hopeful and curious about the future. And I think you left us with a lot of thoughts. So I don't see any further questions. And unless we have, I don't know, do the panelists have any further questions to our speakers? I acknowledge it's already very late in Switzerland. So I think I would then like to thank you all very much for a very interesting afternoon and evening. I hope we stay in touch. I hope we continue the discussion. And yeah, thank you again very, very much.
Thank you very much for bringing us together. It was very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and in particular also to the colleagues from the embassy, I appreciate very much your efforts. And again, thank you so much to His Excellency Ambassador Fassel for taking the time. Thank you.